occasionally when it's a beautiful day. Thank you for coming inside on such a gorgeous day. You will be rewarded for your efforts. Today we are privileged to listen to a very distinguished speaker address a topic that is important to every one of us who are Americans, or if you're not an American, if you live in the Western world, or a citizen of another country, we have some of the audience who fit that bill, you will also find it just as important as those of us as Americans do. The question of Islam and the place of pluralism and democracy in Islam. Our speaker today is Professor Asma Afsaruddin, who got a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, just to the northeast, then went to the East Coast, where she did her master's and PhD at Johns Hopkins University in Islamic studies and in Arabic language and literature. She taught for 3 years at Harvard University before we managed to persuade her to come back to this part of the country. She joined the faculty here at Notre Dame in 1996 and has been making her way up through the ranks ever since. Her major publications include her first book on excellence in precedent, medieval Islamic discourse on legitimate leadership. She has a book coming out from Oxford at the end of this month entitled The First Muslims, History and Memory. She's edited or co-edited 3 different volumes. One that addresses the role of women in public space in Islam. Another volume which is devoted to the study of the Arabic language. She's published, at least by the end of last year, the last CD that I had access to, 16 articles in major journals, another 6 chapters in books, and I didn't count all of the publications in popular venues, etc., but just you can take my word for it, a lot. That's why I didn't count them all. She's currently working on a book on jihad and martyrdom, which is entitled Striving in the Path of God, Jihad and Martyrdom in Islamic Thought and Practice. She's already won support for this from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. She is in wide demand as a speaker throughout the United States and in Europe. Since coming to Notre Dame, she's given more than 70 public presentations at universities, in think tanks, places like that. She's also, since coming here, not counting what she did prior to that, given over 21 papers at professional societies. You're about ready to find out why all of these people want to hear Professor Afsaruddin. Today she will be speaking on combating extremism, democratic virtues, and pluralism in Islam. Please join me in welcoming Professor.
Well, thank you, Greg. That was an unusually generous introduction, and after that build-up, I'm almost afraid to speak because I'm just bound to let you down. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be able to address this audience and delighted to be part of what's fast becoming a venerable tradition at Notre Dame, the Saturday Scholar Series. It's a wonderful opportunity for faculty and alumni, among others, to intermingle and discuss issues of vital concern to all of us. So thank you again. Pluralism and diversity, often used interchangeably, are among those buzzwords that many of us instantly recognize today as something positive and worthy of achieving. And indeed, the world we live in today is shaped in many ways by pluralism. In fact, by a plurality of pluralisms. We talk about religious pluralism, cultural pluralism, ethnic diversity, and multiple group identities. At the beginning of the 21st century, contemporary American society may be regarded for good reason as the embodiment of these multiple pluralisms. We take justifiable pride in the fact that this country has traditionally been hospitable to immigrants from all over the globe who have come here to seek increased opportunities for a better life for themselves. Their presence is reflected concretely in the various churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples that dot the landscape of America, in the multitude of cultural and advocacy groups they join, in the growth of multicultural studies on our campuses, which recognize and celebrate this diversity. Although the concept of liberal pluralism would not be born until roughly the 1950s, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville would already notice the pluralist tenor of American society when he visited the United States in 1831. It is still, and even more so, true today. Many have assumed that the American, and more generally the Western political experience, is naturally conducive to the development of pluralistic societies in the context of modernity. In contrast to the Western experience, some have suggested that Islam as a reified, ahistorical essence is ill-suited to pluralistic societies and is immune to consensual democratic forms of government because of its assumed intrinsically authoritarian and hegemonic nature. The rest of my paper will be devoted to deconstructing such assumptions and making a case for the alternative scenario, that there are in fact rich historical and ideational resources within the Islamic tradition or traditions that may be marshaled and are being marshaled to support pluralistic and democratic societies in the Islamic world. I will start with the foundational sacred text of Islam, the Quran, revered by Muslims as the revealed word of God, in order to retrieve certain scriptural injunctions that have been deployed as proof texts to support pluralism. Scriptural support for pluralism is actually relatively easy to find in the Islamic context. As particularly modernist and liberal Muslims are inclined to say today, toleration of religious and ethnic diversity is a highly cherished core value of Islam. The Quran states in chapter 49, verse 13, and I quote, "O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes, that you might get to know one another. The noblest of you in God's sight is the one who is most righteous." According to this highly important verse, national and tribal, or for that matter, other identities, create the imperative for humans to get to know one another while respecting their differences. In the ideal conception of matters, differences should be the basis for affirming our common humanity and not to generate conflict. Another verse, verse 48 from chapter 5 of the Quran states, "For every one of you we have appointed a different law and way of life. And if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community. But he willed it otherwise, in order to test you by means of what he has given you. Hasten then to do good works. To God you all must return, and then he will make you truly understand all that on which you were inclined to differ." According to this verse, it would not be difficult for God, after all, to fashion a single community out of all humankind if he so willed. But the Quranic view is that pluralism is a divinely mandated feature which adds richness and variety to human existence. Quranic endorsement of freedom of conscience and what is now understood to be the modern human right to choose one's religion may also be inferred from its second chapter, verse 256, where the Quran clearly states that there is no compulsion in religion. The Quran further maintains that all the children of Adam are honorable, chapter 17, verse 70, and that all righteous monotheists, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, will win their reward in the next world, chapter 2, verse 62. It admits of interreligious dialogue with the people of the book, this is the term for Jews and Christians, conducted with civility and in recognition of common ground. as in chapter 29, verse 46, which counsels Muslims to say to the people of the book, "We believe in that which has been revealed to us and revealed to you, and our God and your God is one, and to him we submit." Within the universal community of human beings who are equal before the divine being, linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences are to be embraced as part of God's mercy. These differences are also projected as signs of God, upon which humans should reflect in order to enhance their knowledge. And of his signs, the Quran says, is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your tongues and colors. Surely these are signs for the learned. Chapter 30, verse 22. Diversity is thus meant to be part of the divine plan for us. Religious pluralism finds special resonance in the Quran when it makes clear, quite categorically, that all places of worship should be respected and protected. The Quran states, "And if God did not restrain some people by others, cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques in which God's name is much remembered would have been pulled down." This is from chapter 22, verse 40. It is significant that the Quran refers in this verse to the various places of worship in which God's name is venerated, all of which are equally entrusted to believers for their safekeeping. Thus here too, one may find a valuable proof text in favor of religious pluralism. It is necessary to state here that most pre-modern commentators, however, did not, and I should probably say could not, given their particular historical circumstances, recognize the full pluralist potential of these verses. For example, pre-modern commentators understood the Quranic principle of mutual knowing, getting to know one another, as extending primarily to the members of one's own community and extended families, so as to further strengthen the bonds of friendship and kinship and affection, as did, for example, the 10th century commentator At-Tabari. Today, however, a number of modern commentators in a globalizing world are affirming that this Quranic principle of mutual knowing mandates active and positive interaction with one another, regardless of faith, ethnic, national, and other potentially divisive backgrounds, while maintaining and embracing our differences. I'm sure many of you are aware of similar initiatives being taken by many Christian and Jewish scholars today in regard to their own scriptures, who are retrieving a more universal message of pluralism from traditional biblical concepts of hospitality and neighborliness, concepts which in a pre-modern context would have applied primarily to members of one's own community. So much for scriptural ideals. The question may be asked, did Muslims, spurred by their religious texts, attempt to translate some of these ideals into reality over time? A much harder task. A quick survey of history allows us to answer yes for at least some of the time. When Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, emigrated from Mecca to Medina, two cities which are in Saudi Arabia today, he found himself in a pluralist situation. There was religious as well as tribal diversity in Medina. He not only accepted this diversity, but legitimized it by drawing up an agreement with different religious and tribal groups and accorded them through this agreement specific rights of their own. This agreement is known as the Pact or Constitution of Medina. By the way, I hope you all had a chance to pick up a handout because many of these terms occur on that. What is noteworthy in this agreement is that altogether, Muslims from Mecca, Muslims of Medina belonging to various tribes, and the Jews of Medina belonging to different tribes, together were recognized as constituting a single community, in Arabic called Ummah, who were bound together not by a common religion, but by the common precepts of upright and ethical behavior towards one another, and by the moral obligation to uphold what is good and right and to prevent the doing of wrong. Historians of Islam have pointed to this event as the earliest evidence of the pluralist impulse within Islam. When Islam expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula into Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, for example, it encountered the earlier largely Christian populations of these areas. In return for the payment of a poll tax from which the poor, the elderly, and religious functionaries were generally exempt, these Christian populations were granted protection of life and property and the right to practice their religion. For at least a couple of centuries after the Muslim conquests, until roughly the middle of the 10th century, the majority of the population in these regions remained Christian. This general tolerance of religious others was also extended to the Zoroastrians of Persia and later to the Hindus of India. Our historical sources point to the active participation of many Christians and Jews in the flourishing intellectual life of the Islamic world from the 8th century on. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Syriac-speaking Christians, funded by their Muslim patrons, translated the classics of the ancient world written in Greek into first their native tongue and then into Arabic. Their inclusion in the intellectual life of medieval Islam helped to preserve the wisdom of the ancient world for posterity. Individual Christians and Jews sometimes obtained high positions in Muslim administrations throughout the medieval period. 2 Christian physicians, for example, attended to Harun al-Rashid, the celebrated ruler in Baghdad of Arabian Nights fame. The Islamic civilization at its zenith, roughly between the 8th and 12th centuries of the Common Era, was a cosmopolitan civilization whose members were of different ethnic, religious, and cultural backgrounds. In the popular mind, the adjective Islamic or Muslim tends to be automatically identified with Arab. This perception needs to be highly qualified. Even in the classical and medieval periods of Islamic civilization, those who were its shapers were not only Arabs, but also Persians, Turks, Berbers, Armenians, Circassians, among others. And as I've stated, they were not all Muslims. Christians of various denominations and Jews have left their enormously important mark as well. Medieval Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain, has become a byword in the contemporary period for Abrahamic coexistence. While allowing for some romanticization of this period, it is still possible to state that this was an era when Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to a considerable extent, were active participants in the cultural and intellectual life that flourished in Al-Andalus. A colleague and friend of mine, Jacob Bender, is currently working on a documentary about Averroes, known in Arabic as Ibn Rushd. He was a famous 12th century Muslim philosopher and scholar, and who was a product of Al-Andalus. And Averroes' life is strong testimony, in part, to this active interfaith cooperation, particularly among scholars in Al-Andalus. And Jacob now wants to go on and make another documentary about Maimonides, who may be known to many of you, known in Arabic as Ibn Maymun, who spent part of his life in Al-Andalus and then later moved to Egypt, a prominent 12th century Jewish philosopher who again benefited from this spirit of interfaith cooperation and camaraderie among scholars in particular. And then to complete this Abrahamic trilogy, Jacob gets ambitious every year. He plans to do a third documentary on St. Thomas Aquinas. I think his name is definitely well known here. The great 13th century Christian scholar, not from Al-Andalus, but who nevertheless benefited from this trans-religious and cross-cultural sharing of knowledge in the medieval period. And interestingly enough, and for good reason, the rubric that Jacob applied to this massive project, which will take years to complete, he calls it Revelation Reason. And in fact, these 3 great figures whom I just referred to are testimony. Their lives testify, exemplify the synergy between revelation reason and the positive results that can ensue from this active synergy. It is time for a disclaimer here. By no means am I suggesting that relations were always harmonious between Muslims and non-Muslims, and that there was never any discord between them. Relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims were variegated and complex, and would have to be studied in specific historical and cultural contexts. Most of the interconfessional strife, however, tended to be driven more by historical and political reasons rather than theological ones. The Quran's decree of non-compulsion in religion and its injunction to show kindness towards Jews and Christians in particular, on the whole, there were exceptions, but on the whole, prevented attempts toward wholesale, forced conversions of non-Muslim populations. Within the liberal Islamic understanding of religious choice, and certainly within the Quranic context, freedom of conscience, ideally speaking, is, or should be, an inalienable right of every individual. The question that probably comes to the fore right about now is how then, in spite of a tradition that is arguably supportive of pluralism, are we to explain the phenomenon of certain extremist and rejectionist elements coming out of the Islamic world today, who reject coexistence with different kinds of people and have proved themselves to be extremely intolerant, not only towards non-Muslims, but also towards the large majority of Muslims who happen to disagree with them. To add more to people's confusion, they also cite specific verses from the Quran and point to historical precedents in defense of their position, and to the uninformed they appear quite authoritative. This is where we need to point to the power of scriptural interpretation. Scripture, and this is true whether we're speaking of the Bible, the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita, is often what its followers make of it. All of these sacred books contain passages that have both potentially inclusivist and exclusivist meanings. That is, inclusive and tolerant on the one hand, exclusive and intolerant on the other, with the latter version sometimes inciting to violence. Within the complex history of Islam, there has been a fair number of exclusivists who have progressively stifled, but never fully extinguished, the original pluralist impulse of the internally diverse Islamic tradition. For example, a number of pre-modern jurists attempted to considerably circumscribe, if not downright undermine, the Quranic principle of non-compulsion in religion, for less than salutary political and self-serving reasons. We would be less than honest if we did not admit that there is a pool of thought generated by specific figures and thinkers, in particularly the late medieval period, that the extremists can draw upon to justify their worldviews. One of these figures is Ibn Taymiyyah from the 14th century. His name occurs on your handout. Otherwise brilliant jurist and theologian, who was forced to flee with his family from Damascus, Syria, from the onslaughts of the Mongol invaders at that time. This experience was clearly traumatic for Ibn Taymiyyah and colored his views of the Mongols forever. The same Mongols during Ibn Taymiyyah's lifetime became Muslims, but he refused to recognize them as such, claiming that despite their outward profession of faith, they still adhered to their pagan tribal law in contravention of the divinely revealed law of Islam. It was therefore permissible to fight them and oust them from the territories they ruled over. It is in Ibn Taymiyyah's writings, in particular, that the extremists of our time claim to find warrants for launching their bloody campaigns against Muslims who do not subscribe to their hegemonic worldview, and against non-Muslims in general. Like Ibn Taymiyyah, they too see themselves as under siege by powerful outside malevolent forces whose spread can be stopped only through acts of violence. The extremists, however, are selective in what they retrieve from Ibn Taymiyyah's works. Although Ibn Taymiyyah regarded armed combat against the Mongols as permissible, even though they had professed Islam, he did not allow the practice of takfir in general against other Muslims. That is, the practice of declaring them to be unbelievers. It is now necessary to stress that everything that Muslims do and say is not to be attributed to what their religious texts say and to their religious beliefs. We would not make that assumption, after all, for Christians or Buddhists or Hindus and so on. Like every other group of people on this planet, Muslims act at different times and different places for different reasons. Sometimes according to religious and moral imperatives, sometimes out of pragmatic and utilitarian motivations, and at other times out of pure self-interest. How certain Muslims choose to react to certain events is highly contingent on their specific historical circumstances. What has been broadly termed Islamic fundamentalism, or political Islam, or Islamism, these terms are used fairly interchangeably, and the radicalism that certain strains of it has fostered could not have arisen before the 20th century, and the cluster of specific events that led to its rise. Among these key events is the abolition of the historical caliphate that had existed more or less continuously since the 7th century by the Republican Turks in 1924. Another key event is the period of Western colonization, starting in the 19th century, of a large part of the Muslim world located in a broad segment of the Asian and African continents. The colonial period was one of great anguish and dislocation for the inhabitants of these regions. A relationship of antagonism would be created during this period that fostered prejudicial stereotypes of the Muslim other in the European mind. The colonized inhabitants of these regions, in turn, would learn to resent and distrust their colonizers. We are in fact still dealing with the crippling results of this unfortunate occurrence. In the post-colonial phase, many Muslim majority societies are trying to build themselves from the ground up. They're trying to come to grips with modernity and modernization, particularly its secular and secularizing aspects, and grappling with the effects of globalization. These changes, coming mainly from the outside, and over which they seem to have little control, have brought about a range of reactions in some of these highly traditional societies. These reactions range from modernist reformers who call for a rereading of scripture and other religious texts to make their tenets compatible with the demands of modern life, to radical extremist groups who insist on a very narrow, literalist reading of religious texts without regard for historical contextualization to justify their rejection of secular modernity. It is the latter group, unfortunately, that has captured most of the world's attention because of their uncompromisingly hate-mongering stance and often violent tactics. And this was brought home to us in a most tragic way on September 11. Although this has been said before, it bears repetition. The actions of these militants cannot and should not be regarded as representative of mainstream Muslims. Our own brief review of pre-modern Islamic societies bears this out. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of other informed people, there is a fundamental clash of civilizations underway. Those who make a case for such a clash are often those who have not studied the complex history of Islam and Muslims. Samuel Huntington, a professor of history at Harvard University, who is the best-known proponent of this theory, is of course not a historian of Islam, and whatever knowledge he has of Islamic history and or of Muslim societies has been picked up from rather skewed secondary sources. One of the persistent myths that he has helped establish is that Islam is a frozen, unchangeable essence and democracy are inherently incompatible, and that democracy is one of those exceptionalist Western traits that cannot be exported to Muslim majority countries. It is interesting and relevant to note that this mindset, prevalent among some in the West, may be found among extremists in Muslim majority societies. The clash of civilizations theory resonates mainly with these extremist groups, who also have a rather skewed understanding of Islamic thought and history. A number of Muslim modernists and reformists today, however, have developed strong refutations of this line of argument. They claim that there are actual scriptural bases and historical precedents which require the formation of representative democratic governments in the Muslim world, pointing particularly to the Arabic term shura and its implications. This critical word shura occurs in the Quran and means consultation in general, and specifically may be understood to refer to consultative government. The Prophet Muhammad himself is known to have frequently consulted with his closest associates on many issues. After his death in 632 of the Common Era, his first successor to rule the Muslim polity, Abu Bakr, was elected by popular acclaim, while the second ruler, Umar ibn al-Khattab, set up a consultative council to select a candidate who would succeed him. By the way, all these names occur in your handout, so I hope you're not too lost. With regard to governance of the polity, it is clear that the Quran does not explicitly mandate a specific form of Islamic government. This brings us to the critical question, which has achieved urgency in the contemporary period. Was there a so-called Islamic state in the early period? And if there was, what did it mean? And what were its goals? Needless to say, those whom we term Islamists today believe there was, and their program, which has been termed political Islam, is relentlessly geared towards resurrecting this assumed Islamic state. The Islamic state for them coincides with the historical caliphate of the first century, during which the four rightly guided successors of the Prophet Muhammad ruled. In contrast to the Islamists, Muslim modernists and reformists do not believe that there is a preconceived blueprint specifying the structural format of an Islamic state as such. Modernists and liberal Muslims tend to regard any state which guarantees certain basic individual and communal rights and liberties as being in accordance with broad Islamic moral parameters and thus meeting the Islamic litmus test. The actual mode of governance may be decided upon by consultation with knowledgeable people, the consent of the public, and the prevailing historical circumstances, since they believe that there are no specific religious directives concerning this matter. With regard to legitimate government, Muslim thinkers in general, and modernists in particular today, tend to insist on three cardinal tenets that are defining of consultative and accountable government, an ideal believed by them to have been pursued by the earliest Muslims, known in Arabic as Salaf, and actually implemented by the rightly guided caliphs. Even the Islamists pay at least lip service to them, but they disagree with the modernists as to the political significance of these tenets. These three tenets are shura, meaning consultation, bay'ah, allegiance, ratification, or a contract, and ijma', consensus, which I will now very briefly discuss. Again, terms that occur on your handout. Shura is a Quranic concept and thus sanctified by revelation and rooted in prophetic practice. Quranic verses which advocate consultation are from chapter 3, verses 158 to 59, and chapter 42, verse 38. The foundational theological, juridical, ethical, and administrative sources maintain that shura as mutual consultation in various spheres is the preferred and desirable method of resolving matters. Shura and the principle of accountability it embodies has in fact been the clarion call of many Muslims railing against despotic government throughout the pre-modern and modern periods. Bay'ah, again meaning allegiance, also contract. This is established through the practice of the Prophet and the custom of the rightly guided caliphs. It is well known that newly converted Muslims, male and female, personally came to the Prophet and gave him their allegiance, which signaled their inclusion in the Islamic community. In the post-prophetic period, this remained a standard practice which served to recognize the importance of the people's explicit or tacit consent to being governed by specific individuals. Thus, Abu Bakr's election could only be ratified by the allegiance given by the people present during the selection process, as were the subsequent choices of the remaining caliphs. The practice of bay'ah continued, at least nominally, even when dynastic rule became the norm. Many modernists argue today that since the rationale behind the bay'ah in the period of the rightly guided caliphs was the soliciting of individual opinion in the election of the leader, such a rationale can best be realized in the contemporary period through the modern voting system. Let me go on to ijma', meaning consensus. Consensus is, ideally speaking, the logical result of the consultative process and collective decision-making. It is not a Quranic term, but its normativeness is established through the practices of the earliest Muslims. Modernists and liberal Muslims affirm that the manner of election of the early caliphs points to the importance of building a broad base of consensus to legitimize key political decisions in particular. These views fly right in the face of what most hardline Islamists say. The hardline Islamists maintain that what they call the concept of divine sovereignty, in Arabic al-Hakimiyya, mandates a specific form of Islamic government formed by true Muslims, that is mainly themselves, who then go on to perfectly and inerrantly apply God's law. According to them, the Sharia, divine law, contains a blueprint for a specific Islamic form of political administration, which is then obligatory upon Muslims to establish on earth. This is so because the Sharia, or the divine law, according to them, has left nothing or practically nothing unaddressed and has a prescription for practically every imaginable human situation. The problem with this point of view is that it is completely ahistorical, and its touted Islamic genealogy is highly dubious at best. To make this case, let's start with the conception of the Sharia. The Sharia is usually translated as the religious or revealed law of Islam. In its basic Arabic meaning, a Sharia means the way or the path, and actually does not constitute law that is positive law as we understand it. It is instead a broad moral roadmap for guiding human actions rather than a detailed prescriptive legal system for every aspect of life as maintained by hardline Islamists. It is worth noting that out of the 6,000 verses in the Quran, only approximately 500 verses, slightly less than 10%, have to do with legal rulings. The second source of the religious law is the Sunnah, which refers to the sayings and deeds of the Prophet. From the Quran and the Sunnah, specific legal rulings in specific circumstances may be derived through human effort and reasoning. The result is fiqh, jurisprudence or science or study of the law, which by definition is a product of human reasoning. You probably were not bargaining for so many Arabic terms being thrown at you, but you're going to get a lesson in Arabic nevertheless. The problem is that most Islamists conflate Sharia with fiqh, thus attributing immutability, that is an unchanging nature, and divine origin to many legal rulings that are rather the product of human reflection and deliberation, and thus contingent and changeable. Thus, regarding the public political realm, the Sharia may be understood to have broad moral guidelines without mandating a specific form of government or mode of political authority. For example, the Quran maintains it is important to control chaos and promote a lawful, ordered society. Beyond that, it does not specify a mechanism for bringing this about. One may thus argue that if ultimately the purpose of human governance is to promote lawfulness and order in society, while guaranteeing certain basic human rights, any mode of governance which leads to the achievement of this objective is permissible and in itself morally neutral. Thus, a democracy in the modern sense is also permissible, according to this line of reasoning, as a means towards realizing the common good. The law, in fact, must always uphold the common good, in Arabic known as maslahah, as many pre-modern and modern jurists have maintained. These jurists emphasize the application of the intent and overall objectives, in Arabic maqasid, of the religious law more than its literal injunctions. Modernists today in particular have foregrounded this line of argument and thus place more emphasis on the discernment of the ratio legis, the underlying cause or the rationale of specific legal precepts, than on their literal textual meaning. To support their views, the modernists point to the writings of medieval scholars such as Al-Ghazali, Al-Tufi, and Al-Shatibi, who similarly emphasized such legal reasoning. This is therefore not a newfangled view. It is this legal genealogy that needs to be emphasized to convince the large majority of Muslims that this kind of reasoning was already a vibrant part of the classical legal heritage, and it is this heritage that needs to be resurrected and implemented with appropriate adjustments in the contemporary period. In contrast, concepts such as al-Hakimiyya, divine sovereignty, created ex nihilo by hardline Islamists, cannot be found before the 20th century and represent major departures from the classical Islamic political thought. In conclusion, there is powerful religious and historical precedent, therefore, for the creation of modern civil societies that protect individual and collective liberties within the world of Islam today. And we already see a number of democratic societies in Muslim-majority countries, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Senegal, and even see the stirrings of democracy in the Shiite theocratic country of Iran. Comprehensive polls conducted in Muslim-majority societies in recent years have clearly demonstrated this trend. For example, the Pew Global Attitudes Project within the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press, based on a poll of 16,000 people in 20 countries, plus the Palestinian territories, released a survey in June 2003, which established that a majority of the people in many Muslim-majority countries favor democratic governments, and that more inhabitants of these countries were desirous of democracy than residents of Eastern Europe, for example. According to a more recent Gallup poll conducted in 2005 and 2006, among 10,000 Muslims in 10 Muslim-majority countries, most Muslims, men and women, clearly stated that they want the religious law upheld in their societies and they want to be ruled by democratically elected leaders. In other words, a majority of Muslims are saying today that it is possible to be religious, even in the public sphere, and live in democratic societies at the same time, and that classical Islamic notions of good governance actually mandate democratic modes of political participation today. The desire for representative and accountable governments, for pluralism and tolerance, which are the characteristic features of the modern civil society, remain then the cherished core values of a majority of Muslims. Those who argue otherwise, Muslim and non-Muslim, need a reality check and a thorough lesson in history. Muslims, of course, ultimately bear responsibility themselves for transforming their own societies today and for realizing what has arguably been an Islamic ideal from the formative period. To cut the ground out from underneath the extremists who threaten to engulf a number of the societies, Muslims must continue to emphasize and struggle to implement these basic values of virtuous and humane societies, values that are part and parcel of their own intellectual and cultural heritage. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Afsaruddin, for a view into the Islamic world that you don't typically see on your television set. The floor is now open for questions. We have about 14 minutes. I will call time at 1 o'clock because people have other commitments. But we do always leave some time for questions. So, yes, sir.
I've always viewed secularism as one of the geniuses of the Constitution. If the Muslim Brotherhood got in power tomorrow, would they consider the Coptic Christian part of the Ummah?
Actually, there's quite a bit of variety among the Muslim Brotherhood. There are some really hardline Islamists who are extremely intolerant, and that's probably the image that we have of them in the West, because we tend to hear about them because they are resorting to sometimes sensationalist tactics that make the banner headlines. But there is a very moderate faction within the Muslim Brotherhood that believes in democratic elections, believe in taking part in the overall political system and working within the system for changes. So even within organizations like that, we have to recognize that there is a spectrum of thought, and it's not possible to speak of them in stark black and white terms.
The PLO was kind of secular, wasn't it?
I'm sorry?
Was the PLO kind of a secular organization?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And
Christian and Muslims.
yeah, and they work together quite well. So the point of it is, if you don't have a secular system, then you're not going to get this kind of participation. But it depends on who you talk to. The Justice and Development Party, for example, in Morocco, are extremely inclusive. At least the ones I've met and talked to. There was a conference recently in London that I attended at Westminster University. It was an unusual one where they brought Western academics and scholars from various backgrounds and invited a number of Islamists. And they were all over the board in terms of their political views and so forth. And that was deliberate because the idea was to engage as many different kinds of Islamists from the Muslim heartlands in these discussions. And you'd be surprised at the kind of flexibility that they were capable of demonstrating on a number of issues. Now, I think it's a good idea to allow some of them to come to power if that's what the people want. They're going to make mistakes, and they need to make these mistakes. If democracy is going to hold, we have to respect the will of the majority. If they really mess up in a bad way, they will be voted out of office. I mean, well, I know that's a popular thing to say sometimes, but we have to take that risk. Otherwise, what happens is what happened in Algeria. Then there's a horrible backlash, and it degenerates into violent anarchy. That has not been a good solution either. Why not try the other kind of solution?
Okay, back up in the back, yes, sir.
Professor, thank you.
Very much. This is not the first talk I've been to where someone proposes views that might be considered moderate or, acceptable to Americans. And I'm going to put my glasses on. They're sunglasses, but they're prescription. Otherwise, I can't see. Sure. I know there was a doctor in Phoenix. I forget his name, but I attended a film that he presented. But my concern is this: is that your voice is sort of a voice in the wilderness. And I know that we're here at a beautiful campus, and you participate in other places. But it seems that in the Muslim world, in particular, your voice would get shouted down. I know 48 hours ago, several dozen people were killed because they were trying to kill Benazir Bhutto. My question is, and I'm phrasing it this way because it is provocative, would you be able to give this speech in Saudi Arabia? And if you were, what would be the reaction, do you think?
Because actually 2 years ago, I was in Saudi Arabia, part of a workshop on democracy, organized by an organization that I belong to, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. And I gave a very similar but a condensed version of this talk. It was extremely well received. Now, don't forget, not too many women give public speeches in public fora. We met nothing but the most amazing hospitality and receptivity. Now, it was a closed session, and people were invited from several spheres. But even given that condition, we were all very pleasantly surprised by the way we were able to generate a very spirited discussion about democracy. And it's interesting, when people feel they are in a safe environment, the way they open up. Most of the people, and these were people from all walks of life, they were not all academics and scholars, they were government officials, journalists and so forth. And it was incredible how many of them voiced discontent with the current Saudi government and the kind of administration that is available there, that they thought in the time was ripe for a change, and that there were many of these voices, probably not having reached a critical mass yet, but probably about to reach a critical mass. And I find it particularly encouraging that these voices are rising to the fore. I disagree with you that voices like mine and other moderate voices or liberal voices are in the minority or would be shouted down in the Islamic heartlands. I don't see any evidence of that. I think, unfortunately, given the fact that the media in general, whether it's the print media or the broadcast media, tend to focus on news that create a splash, and mild-mannered, moderate liberal types are not going to break into the front page. But that doesn't mean our work is not making a difference. I actually beg to differ with you on this point. I think we are making a huge difference. It's going to take a while. It won't happen overnight. And if I may, can I point out something to you? Just recently, just last week, how many of you heard of this fact that 138 Muslim religious scholars from over 20 countries signed an open letter and sent them to various Christian religious authorities, including Pope Benedict, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, and several Orthodox and Protestant leaders? How many of you saw that in your local newspaper or saw it on the front page? Did you see it on the front page of anything? I didn't think so. I didn't think so. Excuse me? A colleague of mine wrote an op-ed piece on that. I just want to read one line. I think that really cuts to the heart of the matter, and I think would address your question head on. He was saying, why is it so difficult for us to hear Muslim voices for moderation and peace, and so easy to hear only voices calling for indiscriminate violence in the name of Islam? Why wasn't this letter publicized more? It was a historic letter. It was an amazing attempt at bridge building, and many Christian leaders have already responded, and you probably haven't heard of the response either. So that's just an example of how much, there are many different activities in that vein going on. We don't hear of them, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. They do.
Yes, here and then back up here.
I congratulate you to an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I've wondered sometimes, Christianity also has had periods of horrible intolerance of the other religions, but I've wondered sometimes if there's something different in the founding of Islam and the founding of Christianity, where Christianity's founder died and crucified in the hands of civil authorities, but Islam's founder became himself a civil ruler who converted with force in many circumstances. If that alters the possibility for these liberalizing tendencies and religious freedom in Islamic-controlled countries.
Well, actually, I have to take issue with your statement about converting by force. The Quran clearly forbids that, and there is no evidence in the Prophet's life for having converted by force or large-scale conversion after his death by the rulers who succeeded him. Because Islam, the Quran clearly recognizes Judaism and Christianity, and those are the two groups that Muslims came into contact with in the early period. They're recognized as fellow believers in the one God, and that they are allowed to practice their religion if they agree to also live in peace with the Muslims. And if you think of, for example, the Ethiopian Christians who gave refuge to a number of Muslims at the worst time of the persecution by the pagan Meccans, Muslims have remembered them with great affection and have not even imposed on them the tax that would otherwise normally have been levied on non-Muslims and particularly people of the book. So if you get past that situation, yes, there are, of course, important differences in the way Christianity played out in history and Islam. Now, usually Muslims will say, well, Christianity was kind of aborted midstream in the sense that, of course, Christ was then crucified and he could not assume the mantle of political power. But then that hope is still there because of the second coming, where he will be able to finish out his normal lifespan. Muslims say, well, in Islam, the historical trajectory is different because Islam was allowed to play out a natural course of history, including providing an example through the Prophet of how to conduct oneself in the public sphere and in civil matters and so forth. So in that sense, Islam acknowledges and allows for the fact that at certain times, when you've expended all other efforts at peacemaking and conflict resolution, if the only way left for you then to engage what is inveterate evil or wrongdoing, then you are allowed to take up arms. But this is not an indiscriminate use of arms. I mean, it's very ethically circumscribed, and the call to war must be issued by a recognized head of state, a political authority, not just any, Tom, Dick, and Ali who comes up Osama bin Laden and his cohorts, they can't just fall out of the woodwork and issue a call to arms, and that's illegitimate. Within the classical theory of jihad and war and peace, these are very clearly laid out. So even though the historical trajectories may have been different, in terms of the ethical and principled use of violence, there is actually quite a bit of common ground between Christian ethical thinking and Muslim ethical thought.
We have time for one more question. I know some of the rest of you have your hands up. Perhaps you'll be gracious enough to stay for just a few minutes and you can come up and ask her. But I do want to let the crowd get to their appointments. As Luke said so very poignantly, this is good drinking time. I want to respect that. Yes, sir, you have the last question.
I was interested in your comment of the letter that the Muslim clerics wrote.
That's right.
A general, and I had not heard of it.
Not surprised.
I really have a twofold question. One, is there a medium through which Muslims in general will have heard about that? And is the impression, or would you comment on a perhaps inaccurate impression I have, that Muslim clerics have not been willing to, I'll say, take very public issue with the current jihad and publicly and consistently condemn what seems to be going on?
I came prepared. I get that question almost at every public venue, and I have a URL address for you that you can immediately access and find all these petitions, all these denunciations that have been issued by various Muslim leaders, clerics, academics, all across the board. And the address for that is www.theamericanmuslim, one word, no space, .org. TheAmericanMuslim. This website has dedicated itself to collecting all these various petitions. And God knows how many petitions I sign myself, and I can speak for my other colleagues as well. Is that a sign of some sort? I may have spoken too much. Can you still hear me in the back? Okay. They're there. So, but they have not been, again, picked up by mainstream media, unfortunately, and certainly not highlighted to the extent that it should have been highlighted. So again, what happens then by default, we are privileging voices like those of the terrorists and not hearing these counter voices.
They communicated to the Muslim community.
Okay, and then your question was, has the letter been circulated, or is that well known among the Muslim public? I imagine so, because the people who are involved in this, for example, one of them is the head of Al-Azhar University, which is the largest and most prominent religious university in the Muslim world. And I would imagine anything that the rector of Al-Azhar says would be widely publicized in Egypt, for example. I cannot say because I haven't actually looked at any of the newspapers in the Arab world, but I would imagine it has received far better press and coverage there than it has here. But perhaps that could change. I think perhaps if it has, if it generates more responses from the Christian leaders as well, then I think the media may be likely to pick that up. So I'm hoping that will be the end result of this attempted dialogue.
I think one of the functions of the university is to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas. And that's in part what we've had today. And this is what a university should be about, is to allow us to engage with each other in meaningful discourse, issues that matter greatly to each of us and to our world. And I would like all of us to thank Professor